I want to talk to you today about the beautiful constraint that we find our churches and ministries in at this time. I know it may not seem very beautiful at the moment, but I believe we have a unique opportunity to see our ministries not only survive, but thrive today and in the days to come. Some of the greatest moments in the history of the church have been when the boldness of the gospel met with severe constraint. And this combination has been the fodder that awakenings and revivals were made of. And we assume that creativity and boldness and innovation come from an abundance of resources, of money, time, people, and opportunity, when actually the opposite is more often the case. You see, necessity really is the mother of invention after all, and we know that the local church is the most necessary thing to this planet. It is His church, and He will see to it that it moves forward with or without us. And I plan to be with Him as He does so in this time. God has been in the business of doing the impossible or seemingly impossible for a long time, especially when His church or His people are involved. So, if the walls ahead of you seem insurmountable, like Jericho, then find encouragement from what God said to Joshua. Do not be afraid or discouraged, for the Lord God is with you wherever you go. And if the suffering ahead of you is neutralizing you, and your leadership right now in this moment, then remember Paul's encouragement to Timothy. God has not given us a spirit of fear, but one of power, of love, and sound judgment. So church leaders, we have a charge to keep and a bride to get ready regardless of the circumstances. And I want to tell you an encouraging story that's happening right now. So constraints are often supposed to be a bad thing, and we know they don't have to be, but I want to tell you a story. One of my best friends works for a missions organization and shared with me a fascinating story how the gospel is spreading throughout China during COVID-19. It seems that the pesky little mask that the government makes everyone wear there is also messing up the government's facial recognition software. So it's unable to work. And so Christians are more free to share the gospel in broad daylight with less risk of being caught. And so in this instance, a group of Christians is creatively and boldly taking advantage of a severe constraint and turning it into a gospel opportunity. So I want to help our churches approach this crisis with boldness, with creativity, to do the same thing. We want to have innovation. We can use this time to realign and restructure and reopen our churches in a new way for that new normal. And I know we're all obsessed with processing the 3 phases, at least here in the States, but we will ultimately get to that new rhythm of church again, but we all need to realize that it won't be as neat and clean and easy as 3 phases on our spreadsheet. The frameworks and tools that I'm giving you aren't a prescription. I'm not telling you how to do this. They're meant to help you move forward with your team, to find clarity where you are and adapt as things change and we move forward. I'm going to overview the concepts and break down each step for you session by session to help you and your leadership team process it together. Now, 4 of these sessions are taken out of a book called A Beautiful Constraint by Adam Morgan and Mark Barden. And it's a great read. You would likely find significant portions of it helpful for you and your team, so I would encourage you to pick that up. But let's get started. I first want to look at how they define constraint. Now, a constraint is a limitation imposed by outside circumstances or by ourselves that materially affects our ability to do something. Now, we should view constraints not as a restriction, but rather as a stimulus for increased creativity and positive change. Many managerial systems, they're focused on trying to manage out or removing constraints from a system, and this book says we need to advocate for bringing it in and make sure that we're embracing the constraint and using it to push us forward. Now, there are 4 types of constraint. A foundational constraint is one that limits our success just in how it is designed alone. So Zappos is an online shoe retailer where customers can't try on shoes physically in the store. So to overcome this, they offer free return shipping. Resource constraint is raw materials, time, money, people, talent. An example of this would be Southwest in its early days had only 3 planes, but 4 routes to serve. To overcome this constraint, they revolutionized the industry by developing a turnaround time of just 10 minutes when the industry standard was an hour. Then we moved to method constraint. And we all know what this is. This is where we have to do something in a certain way, or we think we do. So think of the fast food industry for like the last 40 years and then the impact of Chick-fil-A. I mean, have you been through a Chick-fil-A drive-thru at lunchtime? And what's fascinating is how they have embraced this constraint and shifted even further to adapt their practices during COVID. So feel free to go out and do some market research. Be sure you're observing this, but feel free to go observe their methodology. Now, time is a constraint that we are most familiar with and often obsessed with. So for the sake of time, I won't break that one down and move forward. So speaking of foundation, resource, method, and time, one of the best stories from this book highlights the far-reaching results of constraint. So think of trains, the space shuttle, and Roman roads and what they have in common. Well, it actually turns out to be 4 feet and 8 inches. You see, the two solid fuel engines that power the space shuttle are 4 feet 8 inches wide because that's the width of the train tracks needed to carry them from Utah down to Florida. 4 feet 8 inches wide is also the size of the roads that were first built by the Romans, which is where some of the first train tracks were laid for steam engines down over across the pond. So, wow, one of the most advanced pieces of technology on the planet is constrained by a convention that was set up 2,000 years ago. Now, I'm not going anywhere with that. Please know I'm not calling you to loosen your orthodoxy, but I am suggesting that you not sacrifice what might be biblical, effective, and essential to your church on the altar of tradition as you realign, restructure, and reopen your church for a new day. Now, with that being said, let's take a look at the stages and steps we will walk through together. So in session 2, we'll begin by looking at 3 different perspectives people usually have on crisis. It's the way you approach it. You're either a victim, a neutralizer, or a transformer. And we'll see how that posture impacts the way we look at this current crisis that we're in. Now, there's also a quick assessment that will help you understand where you are and maybe where your team is and allow you to understand how you can shift your mindset from one stage to the next to the next. Then session 3 is about freeing up your resources and thinking about breaking path dependence. It really explores how we have habitual ways, both personal and organizational, that prevent us from finding new solutions during this current crisis. It also includes a tool to help you and your team identify some of these patterns and address them. Now in session 4, I'm going to give you a strategic framework. It's one of my favorite tools that's merely about really getting down to the nitty-gritty of eliminating the trivial good in your organization and realigning your resources, your people, your money, your capabilities for the highest contribution during this season and in seasons to come. Then session 5 picks up from there with the we, can, if question framework. This is probably my favorite tool in the whole course because it's simple to use and it refuses to accept a we cannot do this because mentality, and it shifts the conversation to, well, we can if we look at how to answer those questions in a new way. It helps keep us creative. It's kind of 8 little formulas to make sure that you're moving in the right direction. It will help you find creative solutions and open up people that are usually closed creative solutions as well. Now, session 6 goes a step deeper down into the individual ministry level and can bring great clarity on identifying the top needs of different groups of people in your church and aligning resources and capabilities and methods to deliver those needs for specific groups of people. Session 7 is about contingency planning for budgets, ministry programming, reopening phases, and more. There are multiple templates and multiple examples from other churches that you will no doubt be very eager to see. Session 8 is really about agile decision making. And as you move toward reopening your church at each phase, it gives you a tool and a template that you can use to not only get clarity now for your planning part, but also have clarity for you and your church in the weeks and months to come as you begin to implement. Then in session 9, it really brings everything all together and is a visual gut checklist to be sure that you are ready to move forward and find some success. Now, before you begin, be aware of your surrounding culture in your church or ministry, your personal circles as well. These groups can unconsciously influence you positive or negatively, especially if you're putting together a task force or team to address this. You want to ask yourself, are you surrounded by can-do people or cannot people? And it's actually okay to have and helpful even to have a few people on your task force like the latter. Just be sure that their posture is one of helpful critique and not just one of being critical, because criticism is not a spiritual gift. The real question is, are you surrounded by people who are ready to shift their mind? Good. Then let's take a look at this first step of the process as we move forward.